All right, this is the Ascension of Babylon. What we do here is we talk about the occult, we talk about spiritual self-development, we talk about the process of healing and integration. So if that's your thing and you're new here, absolutely subscribe to the channel because I'm going to be posting very frequently. And I think you will gain a lot of value from what I'm sharing. Now, getting right into the topic of discussion, we're going to be talking about a very powerful practice that has influenced me to make some major changes and some major shifts in my life and within my being in general. In fact, they have been the main influencing catalyst in relation to some of the shifts that I have went through. And this practice is known as invocation, or what I call ritual invocation, because a lot of the time when I was doing this practice in the past, and even when I do it now, it's going to be in a ritualistic setting, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in this elaborate in-depth ritualistic setting. You can actually do this practice in meditation. You can do this practice while taking a walk if you're skilled enough in it, and this is something that I can currently do. So I just wanted to clarify that. But anyways, I used to be a completely different person than the person that you are looking at now. I was a violent gang member, a violent criminal, just a completely different person. I spent a lot of my life being incarcerated. These cycles began when I was very, very young and kind of moved into a lot of my adulthood. And when I started doing these invocations, everything began to shift within my internal being and my external reality as well. I started seeing things a little bit differently. I started perceiving things differently. I started wanting different things for myself, and my reality began to just completely shift over time. And we can even say I quantum jumped from one timeline where I was going to end up dead or spending the rest of my life in prison to another timeline where I'm a completely different person and I just experienced a completely different life and a completely different lifestyle. So, invocation is a very, very powerful practice. And what you're doing during an invocation is you're calling an extraterrestrial intelligence or some type of spirit into your physical body. You're actually channeling this energy through your nervous system. And when you're doing this is going to begin causing emotional and mental shifts. And through the principle of as within, so without, everything being interconnected and your external world always being a projection of your internal world, as you're experiencing these internal shifts, there's also going to be an external shift as well. And when these shifts are taking place, it is always going to be in alignment with your highest evolutionary benefit, regardless of the intention that you may have when you're summoning these spirits and performing these rituals of invocation. It's always going to be in alignment with helping you be a more authentic version of yourself. But it also requires that you let go of the old self that these energies are trying to transition you out of, and let go of the old life that might just be a projection of different protective adaptations in your psyche that comprise what I like to call the false self. And this is where, you want to be prepared for the changes that can take place. Because when you're doing an invocation, there's going to be these energies that are in your body, suppressed emotional resonance that's going to start coming to the surface. And it's very likely that you've actually created these different parts of yourself that you filter your experiences through, you filter your reality through, and you're utilizing to shell you away from these heavy emotions that are in association with early childhood trauma and other traumatic experiences that you've been through in your life that you haven't necessarily processed. So, with that being said, these invocation practices are setting the stage for you to move into a higher frequency energetic resonance on an energy field and on a physical body level. But for that to happen, what also needs to happen first is the resurfacing of the suppressed energies inside of your body that are actually keeping you in the resonance that you're currently existing in, and therefore keeping you in a timeline where you are not your most authentic self. So there's this resurfacing that takes place, and this is going to require that you actually begin addressing these deeper traumas in your system by feeling through the emotions that will naturally come to the surface when you're doing these ritual invocation practices. So, for instance, maybe you convinced yourself that everything's all good, that you're happy in the relationship that you're happy at the job that you're at, everything's fine, and you don't have any trauma or anything like that. And then you do these ritualistic practices and you start feeling these emotions that you've actually been in denial to and that you've been suppressing for a good majority of your life. You start feeling angry. You start feeling sadness. You start feeling anxiety. Well, you have a choice. You can further inflate these protective adaptations in your psyche to shell yourself away from those emotions. And this is what a lot of people in the occult space do, which is why they don't actually succeed with these practices. Or what you can do is choose the other option, and you can start feeling through these different emotions and giving them the time that they deserve. Because these emotions are actually communications from fragmented parts of you that are likely in connection with your wounded inner child. The wounded inner child that you've been in avoidance to your whole entire life. And the truth is, until we address these trapped energies, even if we can shell ourselves away from them and convince ourselves that we're actually happy, what's going to happen is these energies will always draw to them and actually externalize themselves in the form of physical realities that mirror that trauma and that suppressed emotional resonance back to us. So there's really no escaping these energies. But what happens is when we shell ourselves away from them, they will run our system and, create manifestations in our lives on an unconscious level, meaning we're not conscious of why we're creating certain catalysts and why we're creating certain negative experiences, but it's actually these trapped energies that are externalizing themselves in the form of whatever these experiences are. So maybe it's an abusive relationship. Maybe it's this kind of person that you keep attracting into your life, and you created a protective adaptation that tells you you're a victim to the experience and that you don't deserve it and that it's all them and it's not you. When in reality, if you're attracting this kind of person, there's a reason. Even, mental health problems and physical sickness and illness in the body can absolutely be the byproduct of these trapped energies coming up to the surface, so you can actually process them and then begin releasing them from the body. Now, as well, because a lot of us, for a lot of our lives, are identified with these protective adaptations that make up the false self and can often take the form as identities that we kind of filter our life experience through. We create a reality from this false self space, meaning relationships, jobs, and physical circumstances that are not necessarily a byproduct of our authenticity, but they're a byproduct of the false self. So when you're doing invocations, there's also going to be this death energy that comes into your life, and it starts dissolving these false realities. So it starts dissolving certain physical things that maybe you're attached to in a very unhealthy way, and it's also going to start dissolving your identification with the false self, so you can see a contrast between the false self, which is this artificial construct that you started creating during childhood trauma that you didn't really know how to process, and the true self, which is who and what you actually are, but you just built all of these different layers over that true self energy that you actually came into the world with. So when you're doing an invocation, the after effects are always going to be shifts in your emotional state, which are meant to bring up these trapped emotions so you can feel them and start healing through the trauma that they're actually in connection with. Your mental state, there's going to be a dissolving of maybe certain identities, certain belief systems, certain ways of thinking, ways of viewing the world that are more so a protective adaptation, and they're not really who you are. They're just a part of the false self. And as well, anything in your physical reality that is no longer serving you, these things can begin to break down. And you want to allow yourself to be willing to let go of whatever it is that you need to let go of, so that invocation can actually serve your highest evolutionary purpose, rather than doing these kinds of practices but continuing to exist in these negative loops and these very limiting patterns. This is a practice that absolutely changed my life, but I also had to be willing to let go of the old self, to let go of the old reality, to let go of the relationships that were not serving me. And when I say that, I had to let go of pretty much every single relationship, friendship, and connection that I had with other people when I started doing these practices. Meaning, I had certain associates and affiliates and people that I considered friends. None of them are currently my friend today, meaning I'm not in connection with any of those people. Some of them left my life through conflict and things of that nature that were just a byproduct of what these invocations were initiating. And others I just more so let go of willingly, because I became aware that we were not headed to the same place. And I became aware that it wasn't healthy to be in connection with these people anymore. And as well, I had to process a lot of heavy emotions that were in my system that for a lot of my life I was heavily in avoidance too. And I had to go through some major internal shifts that involved me letting go of certain identities and certain belief systems and certain perceptions and certain ways of doing things and unhealthy coping mechanisms and things of that nature. I had to heal through a lot of trauma that was stored in my body and stored in my energetic field, and this was not an easy process to go through. In fact, in the spiritual community, this is what a lot of people are heavily in avoidance too, and are subconsciously, without knowing it, utilizing practices like invocation to try to avoid. It's more so kind of fueling their identification with the false self, rather than initiating a process within the self that can lead them to embodying more of their true self energy. But when approached properly, invocation is always going to bring you into that true self, authentic self energy. But just like anything that you can possibly imagine, everything is our relationship to it. And there's a healthy way to go about these ritual practices, and there's an unhealthy way to go about them where maybe we're actually using them as just another tool of bypassing what's going on within our system, or in other words, using them as, an unhealthy coping mechanism. So invocation is an extremely beneficial process. And what you're doing is you're calling an extraterrestrial intelligence or a spirit of a higher density nature into your body. And that higher density or higher frequency energy is going to actually start surfacing these lower frequency energies, trauma, and emotions from the unconscious and from your body, so you can start feeling through them and processing them. And as well, things in your reality that are just more so mirrors of the old self, you may have to let go of whatever those things are. And this is all a part of this transition that you go through to embody your truly authentic self and to have a life that mirrors that. But in order to have that life that mirrors that, you have to let go of the old life and the old identities that are keeping you in a timeline where you are not your most authentic self.